Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Reverend Dr. Keith Garner, Superintendent and CEO of Wesley Mission.
Friends, at home and here in the Wesley Theatre, I want to talk to you about the road to Emmaus, a passage that is both a literary and a spiritual jewel. It has so much to say to us. At one and the same time, it's a moving story, it's a glorious testimony to the resurrection, to the empty tomb. It's an explanation of some of those things that happened on that first Easter day. And for Luke, an occasion where he could summarize so many of the themes that he's explored throughout the gospel and comes back to in that final chapter and final verses. It's profoundly different than all the other resurrection accounts. If you were to lay them down one by one in each of the Gospels, there is no passage that is like the road to Emmaus. It is unique. And because it is unique, it is not only worthy of our exploration, but we ask questions of it, and we allow it to ask questions of us as we consider it. I spoke about it at the Easter sunrise service at a very a particular level, but I want to take it a bit further than what happened just on that journey to Emmaus. Very often writers of books will touch on themes and then gather them together as they come to a close to try to give insight, a window on what they've been trying to say throughout the particular book they're writing. And I think this final chapter has more than a little of that about it, as Luke writes in the way he does. Luke starts, as does Mark, with a real sense of fear. The fearful women. If I was to sit down and talk to people about the resurrection, I have to say many people today would not really appreciate that so much of what the resurrection story has to say to us begins in fear. And yet it moves from there to a real place of confidence and hope. And the very energy that will become the life of a community declaring and living in resurrection. Luke 24 has 3 sections and really a conclusion. Bishop Tom Wright, writing about Luke's gospel, has called it the vehicle for his central message. The opening words of verse 13 say, now that same day. He's making it quite clear what you're about to read about the way to Emmaus is linked to what happened in the empty tomb. The two are not to be separated. It is the same day. And so often in the Gospels, days are not just periods of time, but they become components, if you like, packages of messages communicated to those who read it for the very first time. 2 disciples, one of them named Cleopas, the other whose name is unknown. I like that, I have to tell you. I'm just glad in this day, whenever we talk about so many things, we have to have it all puzzled out and worked out in such a way that every detail is neatly before us. We're told Cleopas and somebody whose name we don't even know were on their way to Emmaus. They're in deep discussion. How could they be in anything else after what had happened during the passion, the suffering of our Lord Jesus Christ upon the cross and his resurrection? They're joined by an apparent stranger who professes ignorance towards the events that make them feel downcast. I'm also have to tell you, I prefer that word is better than just sad. Downcast. It's as if the sadness they feel has so impacted them that it has brought their whole existence to a standstill. It has brought them to a place where they are not only puzzled, but they cannot even begin to understand what has happened. And the account tells us he comes alongside us too, wherever we are, whatever dilemmas we may feel in our lives, and we do feel them. On the journey of life, our journey may not be to Emmaus, but it is certainly a journey of life. The location of Emmaus is certainly uncertain. Having been to the land that we call the Holy Land, I know well the debates about which is the road to Emmaus. And in fact, when I chose to take a party along one of the roads to Emmaus, our coach was stoned. And I thought to myself, I wish it had been the other one we'd chosen. But you know, the road to Emmaus is not an easy road. It's a road that's perplexing. It's a road that opens as many questions as it gives simple answers. It's a road that interrogates, if you like, the believer, the Christian, to understand what resurrection might mean. And the name and the place are really not paramount to the passage. It's Emmaus. It's a disciple whose name we do not know. But nothing further is known about this unknown disciple, and even Cleopas. But as I suggested on Easter Day, there may well be an answer as to who Cleopas might be if he was related in the life of the early Christian community. One scholar wrote this: Cleopas and his friends were simply going home. But by that Easter evening, they've found themselves back in Jerusalem. They are downcast. They are right at the end of themselves. They'd had this interrogation going on within themselves, talking to the stranger. They find themselves at their destination. They have a meal, and we're told then they hurry back to Jerusalem. Something dramatic must have happened to them to be able to want that kind of 180 degrees turnaround. To go back to the city they were fleeing, the city they were leaving, the city now that they return to, because it's that important to them. In Luke, we have a theme that scholars call a travel narrative. If you study Luke's gospel, you'll find it's a very powerful narrative. In other words, that Jesus is on the road with the disciples to Jerusalem. Jesus is going from one place to another. And so can you see how a gospel writer who's explored the nature of the gospel through the means of a travel narrative now brings to conclusion his greatest message through a travel narrative, through a journey. And I like the thought of journey. A friend of mine, the late professor of church history and New Testament studies at Aberdeen University, Professor Howard Marshall, picks up on the similarity of the journey motive. He suggests that maybe even there's a link between Acts 8 and 9 and what we find in Luke 24. The same writer is writing the Acts of the Apostles. It's interesting that the greatest story of the conversion of Saul to Paul, of the apostle that will be the apostle to the Gentiles, the great evangelist of the church, comes through a travel narrative also. Let's explore it together. They were filled with sadness. We're told in verse 17, they stood still, their faces downcast. You see, try to imagine it. They're walking along and a question is asked and they just stand still. The question freezes them. The question so moves them that they cannot progress on the journey. Because the question has got right to the heart of it. It has scored a bullseye. It has been the question of all questions. Why is it? They're filled with sadness. The two disciples of Christ were walking home on a Sunday afternoon from Jerusalem to Emmaus. Their hearts were heavy. Their faces were sad. They had believed that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah. Perhaps they joined in the triumphal procession, another travel event. Perhaps they'd entered the city. Perhaps they had gone by that way down that road and climbed into the city. Now they're on another journey. No longer are they waving palms and shouting. They're on a journey leaving the city they'd entered, full of hope, but leaving it with despair. But a week from that day of entering the city, everything is so different. In almost stupefied unbelief, they'd seen Pilate give in to the pressure of the crowd in order that he might be crucified. We might find it appropriate to ask, what kind of sadness was it? Now, that to me is a fundamental issue in the kind of society in which we live today. There is an enormous amount of sadness. And sadness has many different faces. I would guarantee it that if we were to talk together about the expressions of sadness in a societal life that we face today, in a place like Sydney, we would have many different expressions of sadness. I just identify three and offer them to you as reasons why they may feel sadness. There may be that sadness that we might call the sadness of bereavement. It is the sadness of losing somebody that is close to them. That would be part of the sadness they were feeling on that journey. A friend who in their minds, perhaps is dead forever. And I think we avoid talking about death so many. We talk about, I know it's very popular in the culture, we talk about passed away. That's much nicer, But death is how the New Testament talks about it. Now, I actually think it's important to recognize that because there's a finality about it. And as these disciples went back to Emmaus, they were in no doubts whatsoever of the finality of what had happened to Jesus Christ. And to actually talk about it in its starkness is important to understand the power of the gospel and the power of resurrection. I think there's more expressions of sadness, however, in these disciples. Perhaps you could say they were perplexed within their mental processes. They had believed that Jesus Christ was the truth. Now, it's very difficult when you believe something, and what you believe in and what you have, if you like, stacked your life upon goes wrong. Now, that's a little different than merely saying they are sad because they have lost somebody they loved. Not only have they lost somebody they love, but all that they have believed about him and what he was going to do and what he was and what he is seems to have gone. And so the sadness is much deeper now at a different level within their lives. And I suppose, thirdly, I think I push that a bit further and say they had begun to forfeit their life for him. This is the same Jesus who by the water's edge had said, "Come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men and women." And now they are walking back because this same one who had called them, who'd asked them to give up everything, to take up the cross day by day and follow him, the one who'd done all of that is now gone. So at a very deep level, their sadness is not merely that they've lost somebody, but everything that they'd given their life to, all that they had somehow thought was true, is now gone. Now, I say all that because I think sadness is a profoundly deep experience. And we see it in the kind of society we live. We see the first kind of sadness as people lose people. But we see the sadness of people who have lost their way, who first feel that society has got no place for them anymore, who feel that everything that they have believed in about the community in which they live no longer counts for anything. That kind of sadness is much, much deeper. And its expression is to be seen all around us. Verse 21, we read those words, "But we had hoped." I mean, they're so full, aren't they, those few brief words, "But we had hoped." I'm talking about Christian hope now. Shattered dreams out of which there might be something better. In our modern world, we too can be at the point of leaving Jerusalem. If you like, I want to call it the giving up on life moment. What those disciples felt as they left Jerusalem was that life no longer offered to them what they had hoped it would. And so they left. Thank God it's not the end of the story. They were filled with sadness. As G.B. Caird in his commentary on Luke's gospel made it quite clear, it is a remarkable fact that all the time he was with them, the idea never crossed their minds that he was anything other than being of flesh and blood, a foreigner on a visit to Jerusalem. You see, their sadness was so great because his voice was recognized. There's no question about his voice not being recognized in the gospel accounts, though it is true in the garden that his visage may have been somewhat different. But you see, when you're taken over with sadness, normal voices, normal words, normal pictures, normal scenes don't really address themselves to the deepest parts of our lives. And that's the experience of these disciples on this road. I think that the sadness they feel is made worse because people sought to take away even the dignity they had. So what we're feeling is not just personal sadness. We're feeling missiological sadness. We're feeling that the purposefulness of our lives has been taken from us. In addition, him they did not see. You see, they're heavy with sorrow. Sorrow is very heavy, isn't it? I mean, anybody at a personal level who experiences the journey of sorrow will know it has a heaviness about it. And even though there may be times in which we feel that we even talk about it, I feel like it's been lifted a little. I mean, the very image of heaviness is there in the language we use, isn't it? But there was a heaviness about this sorrow. They're filled with disappointment, completely bewildered. But let's move on. Let's not stay there. Important to recognize sadness, but don't say the preacher took you down the sadness road and left you there. Their response was slow. Verses 25 and 26 give us the words of Jesus to them. How foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? One scholar comments, the stranger seizes the platform from the confused disciples. It's as if at this moment they're walking along, they're having this conversation, and Jesus just arrests the moment and powerfully puts the question to those disciples that are there. When they'd finished their recital of pain and suffering, Jesus chided them for their failure to understand the scriptures, all that had been said in the Old Testament through the prophets and all that God had said. We have all had experiences at some point or other in our lives of being slow of heart. This is different than just sadness. For here it's not our experience or emotion that's the problem. It's our unwillingness to believe. Jesus is not only addressing the deep sadness of their heart. He said, have you not believed? Didn't you see me touch the outcast? Didn't you listen to what I taught by the water on the mountainside when I sat down and opened the truths of God? Didn't you get it when I tried to talk about forgiveness and hope? Didn't you get all those things? Jesus is addressing something very, very different in their lives. There is something more than what is happening here in the slowness of their heart to believe. There's something more. We need a sharpness of mind in our belief, a ready heart. Here the disciples are slow of heart to believe everything that they have been taught. At least the disciples were listening, you might say. But consequently, there was bound to be hope that grew out of that. I think at this point, when Jesus addresses them, it's at that moment they decided they needed to chat further with him. As they went in to prepare for the evening meal that was all going to be ready for them, prepare themselves for a meal that probably had already been prepared for them. As he went in, this is one of the really most dramatic moments, I think, of the gospel narrative. It says something like this. He almost motioned as if he's going further. And they say, hang on a minute. Come and have a meal with us. Jesus was used to being in places where he asked people. He asked Zacchaeus, didn't he? Come on, come down and come to your house. Here the disciples say, we want you to join us. And as he sits down with them, so we read, and we can't anything but identify the power of what's been spoken. He took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and gave it to them. We're told quite clearly, then their eyes were open. Oh, this is why the writers of Luke say it's like Acts 8 and 9. You remember, scales fell from his eyes. The one who did not understand, who began to see. There are two great roads, it seems to me, of Christian conversion. One is the road to Damascus, the dramatic conversion of the Saul who became the Paul, but there's another road, the road to Emmaus. We might call this the road of transformational change. We might call this the road that many people have to engage with. Perhaps it isn't as dramatic, but it's certainly the road that turns these people around. It's a recognition scene. And recognition scenes in the Gospels are so important. It's a high point in the narrative as they begin to see. And they begin to see because they say, as we sang earlier, did not our hearts burn within us when he spoke to us on the road? Now we understand what he was talking about. Now we understand that the one who is talking to us is the Christ himself, the risen Lord, The Saviour, the Master, the one who has spoken to us, taught with us, healed with us, the one who's been alongside us, the one who we thought when we looked at the cross that was the end of the story. The one that the women are now talking about, but we don't really understand that they had seen him. But perhaps they were right. Perhaps they were right and we were wrong. And we should have stayed in Jerusalem. There's a dramatic turnaround here. We mustn't lose touch with the table scene that ever speaks of the risen presence of Christ. The firm foundations of our Christian faith are in the hope of the risen Christ. This is the non-negotiable center of everything that we believe. You know, I think that as you get older, you really ask the question, what are the non-negotiable parts of your belief and exploration? It seems to me that here is one of those non-negotiable moments, to have our eyes opened to the risen power of Christ, to know that he is walking beside us, that he lives. He lives. Christ Jesus lives today. And that was their experience as they shared together in that meal. But let's look further. They returned to Jerusalem in a hurry. After making the obvious comment about the slowness of their response, we're told in verse 33, they got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. What did their host say? Sit down, you haven't had pudding yet. What was the host saying? Look, you've come here all this way, now you get up and you go back. And I like it because it's not a short journey that they were on. They were weary. But they would make that 11-kilometre walk. They were weary by what had happened to them. Even more tiring because of the weariness of what had happened. A person who is full of joy and has nothing heavy on his heart can walk 11 kilometres easily without tiring. But give to a woman or man a heavy heart and ask them to walk it. And that's the place they were at when they arrived at Emmaus. You know, they returned to Jerusalem in a hurry. This was not like the heavy-hearted feeling they had when they set out for Emmaus. It was different now. As a pastor, I know how much roads matter in people's lives. For myself and others, I've walked the road breaking the news to a loved one that the person that they had expected to come home from work would not be coming home tonight. It doesn't fall easily to you to be able to share that kind of news. And I know what it means to have a heavy heart going into those situations. I recall visiting a man, the news that his dear wife had been killed. That journey was such a difficult one. Yet, there are other roads that we live in and walk upon that are profoundly different. The news that Jesus Christ has been raised from the dead and was going ahead in every future day of our lives is a transforming walk. These sorrowing disciples are returning to Jerusalem, a place that within a short period of time would produce great pressure for the early Christian people, a place where the early church might well find itself in the marketplace in the Acts of the Apostles, along with many others, believing and belonging, but a place of great challenge. But they will go back to Jerusalem because that's the place where they have to declare and discover and demand of themselves that they are disciples of Jesus Christ. The experience at the table was vital. Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? You see, the experience they have as they share in that meal energizes them. It produces speed, energy, vision. All of that comes from the knowledge that the one sat with them and taking the bread is the risen Lord. When the Emmaus disciples arrived back, they could hardly get a word in. I don't know what they felt about this, you know. They go back to tell the news that the Lord is risen. And when they get back, all the disciples say, we know already. You don't need to tell us. We know already that the Lord is risen. But, you know, it doesn't seem to matter. Because amongst those early disciples, it didn't matter who got the news in first. What mattered is that you got the news. It didn't matter if there was an order of leadership within that group of disciples. What mattered is that they were the energized group of believing and belonging disciples. How it happens is different for each of us. And I believe the resurrection appearances are helpful. Early morning in the garden, the stranger, all hail. In the upper room, amongst disciples that knew what it was to lock the door, or on the Emmaus road, does it really matter? Not at all. What matters is that we meet the risen Lord in our lives. Very often it is different, but in each occasion it is with the consistency of the power of God. The result of coming alongside them, this stranger on the road, what one hymn writer years and years ago called the stranger of Galilee. What this man, this God-man, Jesus Christ did as he walked alongside them was gave them, at the close of this journey, a deep inner sense of peace. An instinctive sense that there is a work to be done. So you can't stay here. You better get back to the city. And a willingness to go and tell others. Let the story speak for itself. The fear of the disciples was translated into a vibrant faith. It led them to return to Jerusalem, and for disciples in every generation to return to their Jerusalems, whatever that might mean. Tom Wright makes the point in this way. In Luke's work, as in the other narratives, there's no hint that the primary meaning of Jesus' resurrection has anything to do with anyone else's post-mortem future. I like that because I've heard Christians mistakenly say, because of the resurrection, we're all going to live forever. Fine, that's not the message of the New Testament. That is true. Be quite clear, you don't leave the Wesley Theatre hearing the preacher say that resurrection isn't in any way about eternal life. It is. But the main message is not that we're going to live forever, but Jesus Christ is alive. That's the main message, because around that main message is gathered all the themes of compassion and holiness and grace and reaching out to the world in its need. All round that great message that Jesus Christ is risen. The fact is that because of Christ, we shall live. Of course, let the church always with gladness declare that truth. Hope beyond death, of course. Hope in life, however, is the main message